Welcome to the Business Analytics Educators Forum. Next up, a talk by David Sammon from University College Cork, titled From Grid to Dialogue.
I'd like to introduce you today to Dave Sammon, who's come to talk to us about his approach using a 2x2 matrix for business analytics. And I believe he doesn't just use this in the classroom, but he actually uses this with industry as well. He has a really interesting approach to business analytics, and I was very pleased when I saw that he was actually going to do this for us. I let him choose what he wanted to present to us, and I think this is an excellent subject. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about it, and I'm probably going to be building it into my own programs. So I'm going to shut up now and pass over to Dave. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thanks so much for having me, and thanks to Annabella as we were setting up the slot for this evening. So I'm really delighted to be here, really delighted to share some insights from something I suppose that's been a passion of mine for many years. I'm in my 28th year of teaching this year, so it's been something that has definitely dominated at least 2 of those decades in terms of using visualization more broadly as a means to improve our kind of thinking process or understanding. And definitely in the last decade in particular, I've kind of really focused in on keeping things simple by using 2x2 matrices, but just using them to help to maybe unlock some value for students within the classroom predominantly, but as you said, Christina, there indeed that can be an undergrad, postgrad, executive education, or indeed in some cases it can be in the boardroom that you find some significant uses. So again, delighted to present on this topic. Full disclosure, this topic is also perhaps revolving around a piece of research work that I'm kind of writing up at the moment. So elements of what I'm doing maybe this evening are quite fresh in terms of ongoing activity. So without further ado, I'll move on. One of the early attendees who arrived perhaps mentioned a variation of this particular phrase. So for the last 10, 20 years, I've definitely lent into this phrase a lot. If you can't draw it, you don't understand it, or any variant that people can recall thereafter, I'm very happy with. I feel that for me, it is a way I like to go to work, and I think what it does really effectively for me is it helps to make things that are invisible visible. And I think that's really fantastic if we're trying to build understanding amongst groups in particular, and especially if we're trying to build a shared understanding amongst maybe newly formed groups, which is what we typically have when we think about students within our classroom. In the context of UCC, just to provide a backdrop, our Masters in Business Analytics would currently have about 160 full-time students on it. So again, you have a lot of group activity, and you have a lot of various different individuals, different backgrounds, who are coming together and working in the name of data and analytics. So again, trying to increase the opportunity for all sides to develop a better understanding, I think is maybe really where I see the role of maybe our sketching or our visualization. And again, 2x2s play a lot for me in that particular space. If we think about a 2x2 matrix in particular, in terms of kind of supporting our visual thinking, I do see them as perhaps analytical artifacts in and of themselves, very aware of their limitations in terms of we're taking a very reductionist view on something. But again, it allows us to really see the tensions that might exist between maybe two things that we feel are related and maybe have a very interesting relationship. So again, a very interesting concept in that respect. A 2-in-1 query, I think another way of looking at them, we're able to kind of ask 2 questions in one, which is fantastic. We do see answers, but ultimately we're able to ask better questions. And I think this has ultimately been a lot of the value behind 2x2 matrices in terms of the use that I have put them to. And maybe more recently, I've seen them as what we might call a micro lesson in analytics. They're perhaps a really good opportunity for a kind of individual or a group of individuals to see something around maybe how they're thinking and the kind of analytical or critical thinking that they may or may not be doing as part of developing that analytical mindset that we're perhaps striving to create as part of our learning and teaching and pedagogical approaches within our business analytics classroom. In very recent years, perhaps even within the last 12 to 18 months, I have perhaps discovered the work of René Descartes. Again, perhaps an individual who's known to some, maybe not to all, or indeed known to many. But again, in terms of reflecting on some of the work, and I've only started to look at the work of René Descartes, I appreciated that the cogito is perhaps connected to René in terms of I think, therefore I am. And I think it is the thinking piece for me, above all else, that resonates when it comes to the 2x2 matrix, especially maybe in the current era. I know we're all extremely worried about the impact of generative AI tools within the classroom, the authenticity of our assessments, how we can fold in maybe the human in the loop approach to using Gen AI as part of the activity of problem solving or doing something analytical. And I think it is to keep that thinking piece alive is important for me, and to keep ourselves as part of that equation in terms of our thinking and thought process. So again, for me, it is kind of really resonated around kind of reading some of what Descartes had offered us. One of those things being also the Cartesian coordinate system, and that idea of us plotting things on maybe an X and Y axis. And again, I suppose, as we might suggest, anyone who is ultimately drawing any sort of a graph where you do have an X and Y axis is ultimately doing so because of the contributions of Descartes. And I think it is something that has revolutionized, we could argue, the visual representation of logical thinking and understanding. Again, my ongoing readings, and I would say this because I've kind of only come to it in more recent times of Descartes' work, is definitely providing me with even more and more appreciation of, let's just say, the backstory or the history or the value that there is connected to using something as simple as the 2x2 matrix. Not to kind of labour the point on business analytics, it perhaps means an awful lot of things to various different people, but the generation of insights to inform decision making using, I think, a range of simple and sophisticated analysis techniques is maybe fundamental and at its core. And I do believe that the 2x2 matrix is definitely something that's on the simpler side, perhaps because I practice building them and using them and experimenting with them a lot from my own perspective. We see them as being simpler, and I do believe, and I can appreciate from seeing the work of various different student groups over the years, that they are a challenge indeed for others to actually think about maybe putting a 2x2 matrix or committing to a 2x2 matrix, building one out, and seeing the value of perhaps the insights that they might gain from such a matrix. For tonight's talk, I really want to talk about four, and I'll move through them very quickly here, 4 examples of 2x2 matrices. They're all kind of unique and personal to me. So they've all come from various different origins. The first one I'll probably spend the most time on, which is the big data matrix. It's probably also the most relevant in the context of trying to get a conversation started or thoughts started around what big data might be if we were thinking about trying to define it. And if we see that as maybe an older type of term now, again, we can think of it as just a data matrix. So again, we might see how that plays out in a second. The other is ultimately kind of about 12 months old, an analytics strategy design matrix, again, very relevant for the business analytics perspective. Very interesting backstory to this in terms of what happened after I had created this particular matrix. And I also used ChatGPT 4, as it was at the time, to kind of build out some of the actual content behind this particular matrix. So again, may inspire others to think about how they might be able to think about an approach, but also how they might be able to introduced this into their own work in terms of building teaching artifacts. Problem validation matrix is relatively new, something that I built out this year. Again, emerging from the reading of an MISQ paper, whereas the previous one was emerging from the reading of a Harvard Business Review paper. The first one emerging from a statement within a vendor's blog some 10 to 12 years ago. And then I moved to the last one, which originally, up to recently, was ultimately laboriously titled GenAI Capability Engagement Matrix, but a more snappier title because we're iterating through this because this one is very, very new. It's the Working the Loop Matrix, which is ultimately talking about how we're using GenAI as part of our practices. So it's the human in the loop, but it's how we're working iteratively through a piece of work. So a kind of a Working the Loop title has emerged as being very reflective. What's really interesting about this is that it is co-designed with a second-year undergraduate student as part of a research fellowship program that we've introduced recently within our department, within the business school. So again, really interesting and maybe something that's ongoing. So very, very early days, if we want to think of it that way. So we'll start maybe with the most established one in terms of the what is big data. So probably for the last decade plus, I've asked this question in one of my introductory lectures in any of the business analytics programs I've been involved in, or indeed more mainstream information systems programs. And even if we ask ourselves that, it's a tricky enough question to answer in terms of trying to find that answer. And I can remember being inspired. Again, the date timestamp on this would be around 2013, 2014, I think, this particular screenshot from an IBM vendor page that was describing master data. I can remember being inspired when I looked at this page, and in particular when I looked at this sentence, because to me, these are the types of sentences that I like to focus in on to get inspiration for 2x2 matrices, because I think what it's providing is a sense that there are two different types of data, be they structured and unstructured, and there are maybe two different sources of data, be that internal and external. So it's not necessarily suggesting that this is going to be, a complete descriptor or definition of big data, but it probably does allow us to kind of see this description more visually. So way back, well over a decade plus ago, this inspired me to create a matrix where I had data type and data source, the idea of structured and unstructured, the idea of internal and external. So again, just taking that sentence and maybe finding the opportunity of saying, okay, we could have two different dimensions and we can look at perhaps the relationships between them. We can kind of see here that in the structured internal, we're probably talking about data that is very much the operational core. It is perhaps the data that we are most synonymous with hearing about within the traditional organizational structure and maybe traditional information systems. When we think about the unstructured internal data, we're probably thinking about all of this data that is not primed ultimately for easy analysis and hasn't been historically. Perhaps an awful lot of this is text-based. And again, we're seeing perhaps a quadrant here that we might refer to as hidden insights. We could be looking at data that is structured but outside. Again, it could be open and available, or it could be data that we have to perhaps pay for from advisory industry analyst firms and various different locations like such. We might imagine that to be kind of strategic benchmark data, so it's external to us, maybe within our organizational structure, but it's also structured data, so data in rows and columns, if we want to think of it that way, primed, I suppose, for analysis and maybe analytical insight in terms of its design. And also we're looking at perhaps unstructured external data. So that might be something like various different social media posts, online reviews, customer feedback. Again, external to us, perhaps, but available on public forums, on other platforms external to ourselves, where commentary might exist that's kind of relevant to ourselves and to our business. So again, just by doing something like this, we're getting a sense that big data could mean these things, and it could be about these various internal, external data sources where we have structured and unstructured data types. Organizations might be trying to do more with their operational core. They might be trying to do more to combine structured and unstructured data that they have responsibility for in terms of its generation, and now they want to maybe use, so that's on an internal side, or they're looking maybe to combine structured data sets external to them with their own internal. And again, we think about things like data warehousing, and we think about other infrastructural examples over the years, and we can appreciate that maybe a lot of these endeavours and efforts were concerned with the efforts at integrating this data. We appreciate now in the era we're in that an awful lot of this integration is being enabled by advanced tooling, by platforms, and by the variety of different technical capabilities that now exist. And sometimes I take this and I maybe turn it into something a little different, because I want to maybe appreciate that perhaps students want to be able to find some of these kind of use cases for themselves. So very recently I would have maybe asked this question because coffee shops seem to be popping up everywhere around Cork City, around Ireland. We might refer to them as the new pub. But they are definitely growing apace. And again, you know, maybe they're all looking for their own USP and their own point of differentiation. So again, if we look at maybe what a small coffee shop owner might really want to know about, perhaps, and I'm working this sentence up a little quickly, but perhaps they might be interested in customers buying their products. They may be environmentally conscious. They may be loyal customers. They may buy frequently. They may want products to be sustainably sourced and produced, and they may want to share their experiences that they have within the coffee shop. Again, we can scale back a lot from that particular sentence or statement of what we might be interested in, and just say that it's about customers and it's about products. So again, if you get students to work through this, you can actually see that they have to think about, well, what would be our internal structured data if that was maybe what we were really interested in terms of product and in terms of customer and maybe product types of customer and so on and so forth. So we probably have our sales data in our EPOS terminal. We probably have customer loyalty data, especially if we want to have some meaningful way of appreciating who is buying, the frequency with which they buy, and so on and so forth. So again, you get the idea that people are thinking about the data and maybe in particular figuring out where exactly it should be positioned on the 2x2 matrix. We might have customer feedback data through an online form or some other mechanism. And again, I'm only using these as kind of playful examples. We might have experience data on the customer socials and maybe even on socials more broadly, where we might be getting an at or a tag, but we're not actually customers. And then, of course, on the benchmarking quadrant, we might have consumer price index data for whatever reason, if we wanted to look at and compare consumption patterns with the price of the basket of goods. Who knew there was even a European Coffee Federation data set available? But again, it opens up these opportunities for students to be able to move between the quadrants, finding these various different data sets or pieces of data that they're very interested in using and being able to create this more holistic, integrated picture. The one thing I think that's also fantastic about this is that it keeps the focus of the conversation on the data itself, as opposed to getting caught up in the conversation around the technology, or let's just say the systems within which some of this data would reside. So it really does help to keep, as I say, the conversation focused on data and maybe create some energy for the conversation in terms of looking at maybe all of these different possibilities for these various different pieces of data. Now, I would suggest that we could maybe do a VVox poll, which is what I typically would do. I might just leave that up there for 30 seconds. I think people's phone may be able to read that QR code if they're that way inclined, or indeed you can just go to vvox.app, use that ID, and you potentially would be able to answer that question. This is just a still image as opposed to dynamic, so we won't see people kind of signing on or signing up. But if those that are here want to give that a go, we can have a look afterwards and see if we get a couple of responses. But in the interim, what I will do is I will show you the most frequent reaction that people will give. So again, this is just a small group, more an executive education classroom from a few years back. So 38 one. That visual always allows you to say that there is always one that it perhaps will not resonate with, and maybe here are maybe some more kind of recent large volume. So you feel it's having the desired effect when you have a class of 150 and you feel that 92% of that class feel that they now have a better understanding of the term and perhaps use cases for the use of the matrix. So again, for promoting richer conversation within their own groups, within their own project teams and within their own projects individually and group, you appreciate that it's probably a very effective means of communicating. So again, the feedback is always quite positive and strong, even in terms of larger volume, which I suppose gives us all a good sense of security in that these concepts can be easily appreciated or more easily appreciated and consumed thereafter. The real value for me in terms of the 2x2, I think it highlights maybe where there may be missed opportunities to generate value. So I think it's quite good at being able to showcase that. It allows people to maybe tailor the kind of analytical conversation and tailor analytics, because people can identify, well, are we looking to bring our internal structured unstructured together, or are we looking to bring our internal structured and external structured? So again, it can actually frame the conversation maybe that little bit more meaningfully and better. And ultimately, I suppose we can appreciate that in traditional organizations, maybe, or traditional contexts, we have an opportunity to appreciate and maybe, let's just say, encourage more cross-functional collaboration, where we would imagine context and contact centres could be talking to people in finance, warehouse, more frequently, or indeed for the first time, depending on the context. So again, there's a real value proposition around that particular example of that matrix. And again, just appreciating where it emerged, where it came from, was a single sentence, but I have ultimately, as an individual, had many years of value from its use across a variety of different classes. Just maybe to connect to something as well specific to a class last year, the number one student challenge last year for our business analytics students was actually trying to deliver value by integrating these diverse data sources. And again, perhaps the big data matrix helps at the early stages of that conversation in terms of even identifying what those data sources are and indeed unpacking them and appreciating the value that and the necessity that may exist within some of those data sources for some of the analytical objectives that we want to achieve as part of the work that we might be doing. Okay, so if we take a breath, I'll move on to an example of another one. Now this one is probably one that has a very different type of story, but I think a real interesting story, and maybe a story of something that wasn't really expected. So as we all would do in terms of putting our content together for our courses, I would have provided a couple of research articles for students to read. I have a small set of Harvard Business Review articles around data and analytics strategy. And one of those articles is the 2023 article by Davenport and colleagues around your data strategy needs to include everybody. Pretty short, digital version paper, probably about 3 pages, but little nuggets. So you set the task for someone to read a paper like this, and indeed they read it, they highlight it like I do. But again, it's maybe another opportunity of seeing the opportunity to maybe create something that might be another way of elevating the conversation. So as I was reading through this paper, perhaps this resonates with a lot of people, whether they read digitally or in print, but you highlight a lot, you write a lot in the margins, and you can kind of see here, at one stage when I got towards the end of this paper, I started to see that there was an opportunity for a 2x2 matrix. And again, it was probably just something that was maybe tying a concept that was at the start of the paper to the end of the paper. So they were separated, and they were somewhat different conversations within the paper. What it did for me, and maybe highlighting the sentences in particular. So this is just maybe a little backstory to the sources of the inspiration. So in one of the collection of sentences, there's this notion of transforming business or improving business. Okay, so just highlighting the two sentences there that I picked up. And there's also this sense later in the paper that those without data in their titles, which suggests that there's also those with data in their titles. So it's almost creating two different sides of people working on analytics or with an interest in doing something analytical, and they may be trying to improve or transform the business. So again, it's just that idea was sparked for me. So I created this strategy design matrix. Again, simply enough, data in your title, yes or no. The ultimate objective in terms of using data to either improve or transform the business. So looking at it from the point of view of performance. If I move through this one quickly, I'll probably talk a little bit about the introduction of GPT-4 and using it to actually put some flesh on these bones. So trying to maybe put some content within the actual quadrants of this 2x2 matrix. So again, just moving through this so that we can kind of see how that happened. I suppose prompting, where I'm trying to tell more about my particular sense that I see this as an opportunity. I see that there is the potential for a 2x2 matrix, and I'm really kind of wondering if indeed the GPT sees it also in terms of the response back to me. Other prompts of notice or of note would ultimately be those where I'm looking to give some examples within the cells, and where I'm also looking for a meaningful quadrant name. So again, you can see that these might be the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle when we want to use these within the classroom that kind of add some of the substance for us. So if we return back, we can see, sales manager doesn't have data in their title, and they might use basic analysis to improve performance. We might have a data analyst, data in their title, routine forecasting. Marketing executive, AI-driven analysis. So they're looking to do something transformative, but they don't have data in their title. Data scientist, using AI ML models to predict something, again, has data in their title. So just even looking at these kind of 4 examples that I've selected based on perhaps being happy with the content that the GPT produced and also curating that content, you can see that you've kind of got nice, tangible, easy to digest examples of 4 different roles in these quadrants, and maybe very different types of analytical techniques being suggested. If we look maybe a little bit more detailed at this, we might see basic data analysis tools for operational enhancers. We might see structured and relatively simple data techniques for analytical optimizers. We may see the use of more advanced technologies like AI to drive some analytical insights. So these might be innovative drivers. And we might see something like cutting edge technologies using larger data sets, advanced analytics, and we might see that these are strategic transformers. Again, not my language, but language that I would be happy with in terms of saying, yeah, I think that's a really good example and a really good descriptor for that particular quadrant. If we look at what happened, I suppose, on the back of this matrix finding its way into the world, this is not my brother, even though he might look like me, but this is actually the head of data analytics for one of the regions of the Heineken company, so the Africa Middle East region. Kieran would be a frequent contributor within the university and has finished his PhD with us. So we would have a familiarity and an appreciation of the way we work, the things we're interested in. He's very well established, does a really, really impactful job delivering value for Heineken in terms of the analytical work. And when he saw this 2x2 matrix by chance one day in a conversation, his comment was, "I love it. This is exactly what I need for next week." Now, this is a person in practice taking something that was effectively a doodle that was now fleshed out using GPT, somewhat curated GPT, and he's saying it's exactly what he needs. Now, where he was going the following week was to a variety of different think tank sessions within Heineken itself, and also to a large data fest gathering in South Africa. So again, you can see the period of October, November 2024. And if you look at what's in yellow, in terms of the highlighted text, you can see that there's this sense of moving to the left and opportunities in the top left quadrant. Now, again, we'll come back to that, but we can recall what's in that top left quadrant. And that's where we have those who don't have data in their title who are looking to transform their business. So again, interesting, this idea of moving to the left. Independently, and I suppose just to identify where that particular section is, no data in your title, and you're in that transformative business process quadrant. Independently, I shared this with Tom Davenport in terms of the 2x2, and he said he found it really interesting because he was finishing his own work at that particular point in time, but also said that he saw this top left, or this left side of the matrix, as being very reminiscent of citizen development. So perhaps low code, no code, the idea that analytics was going into the hands of those within the business, so those who don't have data in their title. So this shift to the left. So again, really interesting to see that one of the authors, the lead author, has this response and this reaction, where in practice, this is also the feedback that's coming back from the use case. And these are happening, if you like, independently. Tom Redman, again, one of the other authors, also very interesting, the idea that it makes complex ideas easier, perhaps creates an opportunity to allow people to have different conversations, therefore broadening their perspectives. And again, I suppose definitely plays in to where I would see the use case for 2x2 matrices and how it can enrich the conversations that we're trying to have, but also makes a really interesting point where they talk about the idea of those with data in their title and the idea of those without data in their title. Just the idea that most people with data in their titles do very little of the actual data work, which I thought was really interesting in that, they don't necessarily own or have any responsibility perhaps for the business processes that may be most associated with the generation of that data in the first instance. So again, interesting that by looking at the difference between those with data in their title and those without, you kind of see that there is a real appetite or a real need for there to be this shift to the left, so that we can have that transformative impact perhaps that is necessary when we invest time and energy into anything that is analytical within an organizational context. So again, very, very interesting that it kind of sparks these things that we wouldn't necessarily think about as much as to maybe where the real harmony might exist in terms of those personalities within organizational contexts. Maybe this particular matrix for me demystifies strategy somewhat. It definitely changes the shape of how people might think about strategy. It does introduce the idea of citizen development. And makes it something that may be more tangible to unpack, especially if we look at the top left-hand quadrant. And it shows that there is a value in this type of thinking in practice. So again, very useful to talk about the impact of this matrix. Okay. So again, conscious that probably takes me to the end of that particular matrix. And again, I'm just looking at the clock now as well. So I'm going to move through these other two maybe a little quicker because they're perhaps maybe newer types of 2x2 matrices that are being kind of developed or in development. And again, it's just to show where they might have a value proposition in other ways. So the idea of arriving at a validated problem statement makes sense if you look at maybe this rather broad and lengthy map of what an applied research project looks like currently for us within our data analytics program in UCC. So we're kind of leaning a little bit more this year. We started to do it last year, but leaning a little bit more heavily this year into echelon DSR, so design science research, where maybe what the echelon gives us is a more explicit call out of design knowledge accumulation over the duration of the project, where you also are physically calling out these intermediate artifacts that are emerging as you move through these various different iterations of, let's just say, problem analysis, objectives and requirements definition, design and development, demonstration and evaluation. So again, without kind of labouring this point too much, you can see that problem analysis can be quite difficult and can be quite challenging for students, especially if they want to try and appreciate what it is that they should do. So having had a look at the Management Information Systems quarterly paper that has been published maybe within the last 12 to 18 months, I would say, in the echelon DSR space, and having a working relationship with one of the lead authors, Tuare Tunanen, I ultimately would have looked to create this particular matrix, again, working with the text within the paper itself. So the idea that there is a sense that we should be looking at sources of evidence, maybe we can categorize those as literature and conversational, which might mean human subject. And there's this sense of solvability. That word is used within the paper. So the degree to which the problem has been solved or can be solved. So again, I suppose it suggests that there's two different states for solvability. If I move quickly through this, we can see, problem space well covered in existing studies. Perhaps there's theoretical closure. The textbooks say it's sorted. So again, we might suggest to ourselves that there's nothing to really look at there. Stakeholders are satisfied with current solutions. Again, if we were talking with people, there might be a perceived closure there. So people think it's not a problem anymore. So again, if we were trying to kind of validate or appreciate what the problem was, we might be looking at that side also. If we're looking at the solvability and it can be solved, theoretical basis exists for new interventions. So maybe there's a justification here in terms of a design justification. So it looks solvable on paper, but no one's nailed it yet. So maybe there's an opportunity space for us there. And indeed, if we look at stakeholders with unmet needs, then and they're also open to innovate, we might be kind of motivated to look at this from maybe a problem and problem solving perspective. So maybe people want a better solution, so let's build it. So again, a very kind of simple yet perhaps effective way of being able to see, well, what does it mean to actually have a validated problem statement, or how do we even get close to producing the evidence behind making such a validated problem statement. And again, something as simple as this can just allow people to connect to various different elements and maybe discard certain ideas as they go, and maybe have those informal conversations with people in industry, with their peer group, with mentors and so on, or indeed as they read through the literature. So our design opportunity perhaps is here. That's where we might feel more motivated and be able to create the strongest justification for maybe doing something that might sustain us as a full project throughout the 12 months of our master's degree program, for instance, is how we might position that for students on the program. So we're kind of appreciating more of a design-worthy space as a result, focusing on perhaps the top right, where real people want change and you can design something to help. But again, it allows us to look at the evidence from multiple sources. We can see perhaps there's some consensus, there may be some conflict, but again, we're ultimately able to kind of arrive at a judgment call as to whether such an analytics use case or such a problem statement that we can derive from our work will actually see us through to doing something quite effective. Again, maybe in a recent use of this with a large enough group, you can see that there was a pretty good sense that they would have an improved or better understanding of trying to arrive at a validated problem statement, having kind of seen the matrix. So again, showing that it does perhaps give something to the actual student, and in this case, students of the business analytics program. For me, supports methodological clarity, maybe balancing the rigor and relevance. So there's theory informed, but there's also maybe practice inspired or problem grounded problems that we're trying to create. And it does also encourage transparency. It does allow people to showcase where they've looked, or indeed would highlight where they haven't necessarily been looking in terms of trying to validate their problem statement or to create their problem statement. Okay, so lastly, and this one will be quite quick. So how to leverage GenAI as a business analyst, maybe a little bit more of a broad scope here in terms of focus. So not maybe looking at the business analytics persona squarely, but maybe looking even more at those who may be involved in analysis and design work as part of kind of information systems practice. And indeed, it is more inspired by research in that space. So again, this is kind of really a 2x2 matrix that comes from a 6 to 8 week kind of small fellowship research project where it kind of captures the essence of a lot of the conversations that were had on a weekly basis between this second year undergrad student doing the work and myself. So again, we're kind of constantly moving, trying to shape the conversation and maybe look at what it is that we're learning at a high level about this use of GenAI as part of the practices most synonymous with maybe business analysis in this context. So it allows us to look at maybe learner engagement. So our fear with GenAI tools is that perhaps the level of engagement can be shallow and maybe not deep enough. But again, with the idea that we might have a very shallow or deep engagement in our content, in the problem, let's just say in the assessment, in the work that we want people to do individually or as a group. And we're very conscious that when it comes to a GenAI tool, the capabilities that it has, amongst others, is that it can generate text and to a certain degree it can generate visuals. So again, it's interesting that if we're a business analyst, that we're probably interested in these two types of output. So if we work through this, we can see that if we had a shallow engagement and it came to using text, we might be very much accepting the text as is, maybe a bit uncritical in terms of our use, very procedural. So we might call ourselves a copy paster. We're really just that persona of how we engage with the outputs of any of these GenAI tools that we might be using. If we're using text as a springboard, we're comparing its outputs to our own outputs, then obviously it does inspire us, gives us that kind of creative extra that we might need to maybe iterate and refine our own work. But it's all premised on the fact that we also have a draft of our own thinking, our own thoughts and our own work. So there we might be, again, simply enough making more sense and doing that in a constant kind of continuous improvement, iterative type of sense. So we're really making sense of the work. If we're taking visuals at face value, and just using them more as decoration than as anything more significant than that within our submissions, but then we might just be something as simple as an image taker. We're just taking these images, using them, but we're not necessarily sure if they're even appropriate or not, if they're correctly capturing what our thoughts might be. And indeed, we might also take visuals as drafts. We can refine them, revise them as part of our ongoing conversation, and indeed they can further enhance what it is we're looking to do in terms of creating our own visuals and our own models as part of more of a deeper engagement. So we might be viewing these as sketches, which again can influence and inform the shape of what we are also trying to achieve, whether that's a notation that is perhaps available to us, like UML, data flow diagrams, ERDs, or if it might be something where we're also defining the shape of that structure. So again, the idea that we see these more as sketches. The individual involved, Mira, as one of the students would have suggested, that she said it was fascinating to see how much of what she had experienced in her engagement with AI tools was being captured by the matrix, which I think again is interesting, that the experiences throughout the work and maybe even beyond the work are very varied and very wide. But again, it's nice to be able to see that we can perhaps concentrate the mind, get ourselves to think about certain things that may belong, or that may, if you like, personify the way in which we might decide that we are using currently in our practices GenAI tools for text or indeed for visual outputs. Again, just a very recent little pop from our polling software. A lot of people believe that they are sense makers, so they are a deep engagement with the text, which is refreshing. Like all of these, we might believe that may or may not be quite reflective to the actual practice, but it's good to see that people kind of believe that that's how they would position themselves, which is a kind of a really interesting takeaway and insight. Again, the real power for us here in terms of this tool, I think it promotes reflection, which is never a bad thing. I know I'm a big fan of trying to get self-reflection as part of the kind of learning process. The idea of metacognition, the idea of being able to make yourself a better practitioner by reflecting on your practices. There's probably a developmental element here as well, in terms of using this as a tool within a team setting, maybe within a project. Again, linking it in some way to the reflective piece. And I believe it kind of helps us to appreciate, maybe in a small way, the future shape of what business analysis work will potentially look like. I know that the project work that we're working on has moved a little bit beyond even the messaging within this 2x2 matrix, but you can see some fantastic usage patterns when you experiment with taking the textual description of how to do something from the likes of ChatGPT and give it to the AI feature within Lucidchart, and then it would actually reproduce the visual from that textual description. And there are actually some patterns in how ChatGPT, for instance, might describe how something should be done, especially if you give it the scenario that you want it to be done for also, and how it might reproduce some of the visual output on Lucidchart. So there are patterns that look like they keep repeating because of the way GPT describes how a process of developing something like an ERD should be done. So again, very interesting as you unpack it, just to see the creativity that you can also bring to the table, both as maybe educators ourselves, but most likely as the student cohort also. So I'm going to wrap up by saying that for me, these 4 matrices in particular are very much a conversation that help us to maybe integrate. They help us to collaborate, they help us to frame things, and they certainly help us to challenge ourselves and challenge our thinking. So for me, a 2x2 matrix has a really, really powerful purpose for us in terms of a kind of a discursive template, an analytical artifact, but also as something that can help us to build that shared understanding as part of the work that we do and the processes that we are involved in as we're doing something in the name of business analytics. The last thing I might say is that I did obviously one that was quite Cork at the start of the academic year. It travelled around a little bit in LinkedIn. It created a whole host of different buzz in different quarters of the world. But again, resonated quite well with people because it represents some of the Cork linguistic tone, which we won't go into now. So I leave it there, and thanks to everyone, and thanks again to Christina.
Wow, I just love that last one. You would have to explain some of those terms to me or something. I need a translation. Absolutely fantastic, Dave. That was so interesting. Well, I'm going to say thank you very much once again.